Welcome to Sleep from History, where tonight we drift back into a world of shadowy streets and ringing church bells, a medieval Europe teeming with danger long before medicine understood microbes. Imagine stepping into a narrow alleyway lit only by flickering torches, the air thick with smoke, tallow, and the sour scent of refuse. The clatter of cartwheels and the cries of merchants echo over the rumble of distant bells. And beneath it all, an uneasy silence because disease is everywhere, and it moves unseen. Here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't last a week. Overcrowded cities reek of sewage. Rats scuttle through filth-filled streets. Water is tainted, and superstition guides the doctor's hand. Fever sores, convulsions, and hallucinations were as common as the toll of church bells, and for many death felt like a familiar neighbor. So before we sink fully into this chilling chapter of the past, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these sleepy journeys into history, and drop your location and local time in the comments. We're building a gentle map of listeners across the world. Now, let's drift together into the darkest corners of the Middle Ages, grim haunting, unforgettable. A pale autumn mist clung to the fields of medieval Europe, wrapping the countryside in a ghostly veil as dawn broke over the 10th century. Bent-backed farmers moved slowly through the cold morning air, their hands rough and cracked from endless labor scythes slicing through the grain with dull metallic swishes. No one paid much attention to the strange purplish-black hue of the rye heads, the dense shells mottled and dark. Hunger was a constant companion, and every kernel of grain was a treasure no matter how it looked. Winter loomed close, bitter and long, and poverty left no room for waste. The stalks were gathered, dried hastily on damp earth, then milled and baked into loaves of bread, their warm, yeasty scent filling small cottages. No one knew that within those humble loaves lay a creeping toxin, an invisible curse, waiting patiently like an ember hidden in ashes, ready to set bodies aflame from the inside. As darkness fell, the first cries of agony echoed through thatched cottages. A woman writhed on the hard-packed floor, clutching her hands, fingers mottled with angry purple blotches, her body trembling violently. She whispered through clenched teeth that fire was burning her from within, that invisible flames crawled beneath her skin. Her children huddled in the shadows, wide-eyed and terrified, watching their mother's body twist and jerk with convulsions, her screams sharp enough to chill the blood. Her husband sat helpless beside her knuckles, white as he clutched a wooden rosary, murmuring prayers into the smoky night. This was the terror of ergotism, what later generations would call St. Anthony's fire. The blood vessels constricted, cutting off life to fingers and toes, and in the days to come, the flesh would blacken and die, limbs turning brittle before breaking away. Villagers whispered of curses of demons dancing on the fields where the strange rye grew. Some spoke of witches who poisoned the harvest, while others believed it was punishment from God himself. And as the sickness spread, entire communities turned their eyes toward the church for salvation. Pilgrimages began to a monastery in the Rhone Valley dedicated to St. Anthony. Within its heavy stone walls, monks in dark robes moved like shadows among rows of the afflicted, smearing sacred oil on their sores, feeding them simple meals of cleaner bread and broth, and praying fervently for their deliverance. To the desperate, this place was holy ground, Few realized that the monks' careful storage of grain meant that the bread offered here was free from the deadly fungus, a miracle that was, in truth, a matter of knowledge, not magic. Yet to those in pain, it felt like divine intervention, and St. Anthony became a beacon of hope in villages far away from the monastery's sanctuary. The disease left horror etched into every home. Mothers lost their hands. Children's feet turned black and crumbled. Men screamed from hallucinations that sent them leaping into icy rivers. Entire families vanished from their cottages, their belongings left untouched as if cursed. Chroniclers of the time sketched strange images, humans contorted in torment, monks lifting crucifixes over the dying, and fields that people swore were haunted. Centuries later, historians would uncover the true culprit, claviceps purpurea, a parasitic fungus thriving in damp rye, producing powerful alkaloids that constricted blood flow, triggered spasms, and unleashed vivid hallucinations. It is even believed that ergotism's terrifying visions may have played a role in the Salem witch trials, where young girls' hallucinations were mistaken for possession. Back then, it was simply a plague of fire, a disease so feared that sufferers were often shunned or locked away. Entire villages bore silent witness as neighbors' limbs blackened and fell away as screams echoed over empty fields. In 994 CE, an epidemic swept through France, killing between 20 and 40,000 people, reducing thriving towns to hushed, hollow places. For centuries, this nightmare returned in waves, following poor harvests and damp summers, striking those who had no choice but to eat the cursed bread. Today, ergot poisoning is almost unheard of, tamed by agriculture and science. Yet its legacy lingers in medieval manuscripts and folklore, in painted frescoes of saints and suffering, in whispers of a fire that burned not in hearths, but in blood. And now, as we leave behind these haunted fields and flickering torches, we drift onward deeper into the shadows of the Middle Ages, where a slower, more insidious disease waited to claim its victims, a disease that did not kill quickly, but turned its sufferers into walking ghosts. This was leprosy, the living death. The path to the monastery was long and treacherous. Families carried loved ones, wrapped in wool blankets, their bodies limp and trembling limbs darkening with gangrene. Along dirt roads, ox carts creaked under the weight of the sick, and the winter air reeked faintly of smoke and damp soil. Monks in black robes would sometimes travel outward, bearing wooden crosses and lanterns, guiding these poor souls toward what hope they could offer. As the bells tolled over the valley, the monastery stood like a fortress of salvation stone walls, weathered by centuries, its heavy doors opening to reveal a dim world lit only by candles. Inside, rows of straw pallets lined the floor, each occupied by a patient, writhing softly, whispering prayers, or staring blankly into shadows as hallucinations claimed their minds. The monks worked in silence, the shuffle of sandals echoing down corridors, filled with the scent of smoke, herbs, and the faint metallic tang of decay. They believed they were performing holy work, a divine calling, from St. Anthony himself, the patron saint of those tormented by this holy fire. It was here that sufferers found respite, not only in the clean bread that unwittingly saved them, but in the gentle care of these men who had dedicated their lives to God's service. In a time when superstition dictated most medical practice, the monastery became a beacon of knowledge, albeit unknowingly. Its methods of carefully drying and storing grain meant their bread lacked the deadly fungus that ravaged so many villages. To the faithful, this was proof of divine intervention. For the patients who managed to heal it was nothing short of a miracle. Yet even miracles had limits. Not all who came found salvation. Many died within those cool stone walls. Their bodies, wasted and scarred, were buried quietly in nearby fields, marked with simple wooden crosses. Chroniclers recorded visions of fire and demons that afflicted patients, described hallucinations so vivid they seemed like glimpses into hell itself. Some saw angels, others spoke of shadowy figures dancing in the rafters. These fevered accounts were passed from monk to monk, etched into manuscripts and sermons, fueling the growing mythos surrounding the disease. Beyond the monastery, entire villages bore the marks of tragedy. In small hamlets, scattered across France, Germany, and England, houses stood abandoned, their thatched roofs, sagging doors, swinging loosely on broken hinges. The plague had a way of silencing life, leaving behind only the whispers of wind through empty fields. In the harshest outbreaks, there were no hands left to bury the dead. Villagers spoke of seeing black crows gathering in flocks above the rye fields, as if warning that death lingered there. For centuries, ergotism was both a curse and a mystery-inspiring fear that ran deeper than famine or war. Even hardened knights, returning from battle, would shudder at stories of villagers whose hands and feet had simply fallen away, leaving them crawling through the mud like broken specters. The disease struck hardest in times of scarcity. A warm, wet summer followed by a damp autumn created perfect conditions for ergot fungus to thrive. The purplish growths on rye kernels looked odd, but hunger overpowered caution. Rye was a staple for the poor, and to waste even a handful of grain was unthinkable. Families baked bread in communal ovens, unaware that each loaf carried the seeds of agony. Even livestock were not immune. Cattle and sheep that consumed infected straw often fell ill, their carcasses adding to the misery. Rural doctors and herbalists were powerless, prescribing salves and prayers, bleeding their patients with crude instruments or burning evil humors from the body with heated irons. Nothing seemed to help. In some villages, panic turned neighbors against one another. The afflicted were accused of witchcraft, their symptoms seen as signs of a pact with dark forces. Mothers with blackened fingers were shunned, children with convulsions whispered about as cursed. Entire families fled into forests, seeking isolation to escape suspicion, only to die alone in the cold. The church condemned these fears, insisting that the disease was a test from God, yet even priests grew uneasy as outbreaks spread. Funeral bells rang so often that they became part of the background hum of life, tolling softly like a heartbeat of sorrow. And then there were the dancing plagues. In Strasbourg and other towns, waves of inexplicable dancing gripped entire communities. Men and women convulsed and spun in the streets for days, unable to stop collapsing, only from exhaustion or death. Witnesses described their eyes as glassy, their movements jerky as though they were puppets of invisible hands. Scholars today believe ergot poisoning could have triggered these outbreaks. The hallucinations and muscle spasms merging into a spectacle that terrified and fascinated medieval society. To them, it was a curse or possession. To us, it is a chilling glimpse of how a simple fungus could destabilize entire towns. Despite its horror, ergot also became an unwitting teacher. Over centuries, careful observation revealed patterns. Grain stored in dry, elevated barns seemed safer. Certain harvest seasons yielded fewer illnesses. Slowly, wisdom seeped into rural communities passed down through generations. Like folklore, never trust rye that glows with purple. But understanding came too late for the thousands buried in mass graves. Epidemics like the one in 994 CE, where tens of thousands perished in France alone, reshaped entire regions. Villages emptied monasteries, overflowed with patience, and fear clung to every loaf of bread. The cultural imprint of St. Anthony's fire reached far beyond the Middle Ages. Artists painted grim depictions of the disease, peasants crawling on hands and knees, monks offering comfort, saints bathed in golden halos overshadowed scenes of suffering. In altarpieces, amputated limbs lay like trophies of faith and survival, proof of the torment endured by those who lived. The Order of St. Anthony flourished, its monks recognized as healers and miracle workers, their black robes a symbol of divine aid. Pilgrimages to their shrines became common, and many who survived credited their recovery to the saints' intercession. In truth, it was safer, bread and relative cleanliness that saved them, but such practicalities rarely eased the medieval mind. As centuries passed, ergot found its way into the pages of history for other reasons. In the 17th century, New England was gripped by the Salem witch trials, where accusations of sorcery led to executions. Modern historians speculate that some of the strange behaviors attributed to witchcraft may have been caused by ergot-laced bread. Hallucinations, paranoia, and muscle spasms would have appeared to Puritan villagers as signs of demonic influence. Whether or not this theory is true, it highlights the disease's enduring power to haunt the human imagination. In modern times, ergot is no longer a terror, but a carefully studied fungus, even harnessed to create medicines. Scientists discovered that the same alkaloids that caused convulsions could also induce uterine contractions, leading to ergot's use in medicine. It even played a role in the discovery of LSD in the 20th century, linking medieval suffering to a modern psychedelic revolution. Yet despite this transformation, the shadows of its past linger. Every illustration in a medieval manuscript, every skeletal figure crawling toward a monastery door reminds us that this once common parasite shaped the fears and folklore of entire nations. Now, as we leave behind these haunted rye fields and candlelit monasteries, the air grows heavier. The wind carries not just the scent of damp grain, but the faint memory of incense and solemn prayers. Ahead lies another disease, one that did not burn its victims alive, but instead stole them piece by piece, turning them into outcasts, exiles, and walking symbols of death. Its name was whispered with dread and reverence alike for those who suffered, were said to carry the pain of Christ himself. As we drift deeper into the medieval world, we come to the next chapter of this dark journey, leprosy, the living death. The road narrows as we wander further into medieval Europe, leaving behind haunted fields of rye and entering the shadow of stone city walls. The air here feels heavier, thick, with the scent of smoke and humanity. Streets wind tightly through through rows of timbered houses, their upper stories leaning close together as if conspiring. The cries of market sellers mix with the sound of horse hooves and the splash of filth from chamber pots thrown carelessly into gutters below. Somewhere in this labyrinth, a faint bell rings, a soft, mournful sound that turns heads and scatters the curious. The bell does not signal a merchant or a priest. It signals exile. A lone figure moves slowly through the crowd, wrapped in rags, a hood drawn low. The bell tied to their wrist trembles with each step, a warning, keep away. Leprosy was not a swift killer. It crept silently through the body like a thief in the night, robbing its victims of sensation and identity, leaving them hollow shells of who they once were. Inhaling droplets from a cough or sneeze was enough to catch the disease, though medieval people could not see the invisible bacteria floating in the air. They only saw the changes that followed. Pale patches spreading across the skin, finger-stiffening noses, flattening eyes, dimming. Nerves died, quietly numbing pain, and that numbness betrayed its host. Cuts and burns went unnoticed. Infections took hold. Slowly, cartilage wore away fingers, shortened toes vanished, and face became masks. Ski. But leprosy did not always inspire hatred. In the medieval mind, it carried a strange and terrible reverence. The church taught that those afflicted were sharing in Christ's suffering, bearing purgatory on earth. Some even believed that lepers would ascend to heaven faster than others, their suffering seen as holy. This belief brought compassion alongside fear. Monasteries and noble families funded leprosaria small hospitals where the afflicted could find shelter, prayer, and a warm meal. These places became sanctuaries, islands of care in a sea of suspicion. Monks would bathe wounds in wine-wrapped bandages around hands and feet and see. Life in a leper hospital was paradoxical. It was both comforting and tragic. Patients slept in long halls, lined with straw mats, candlelight flickering over pale, hollow faces. The sounds of prayer echoed through stone corridors, mingling with coughs and the soft sobs of those newly arrived. Many came willingly, leaving their families behind. Some rang small bells as they walked through towns, warning strangers to keep their distance, their voices calling out, unclean, unclean. And yet, these outcasts found a kind of belonging among others who shared their fate. Outside the leprosaria walls, leprosy was a living nightmare. In villages, whispers spread quickly. A pale patch of skin could make neighbors suspicious. Entire families might be driven out their homes, burned, their names cursed. The fear of contagion ran deep, even though leprosy spread far less easily than people believed. Medieval laws sometimes banished the afflicted to live in huts beyond the town gates, relying on scraps and charity. There in the cold and the rain, they clung to life, watching the world from a distance. For children, encountering a leper could be terrifying. Parents warned them not to look too long or too closely, as if the disease could leap from one body to another through a single glance. Pilgrims traveling between towns often described the bells of the lepers, the sound sending shivers through caravans, long before the figures came into view. Some lepers, resigned to their fate, carved wooden staffs, tipped with iron, to strike the ground as they walked, a rhythm of exile that echoed down empty roads. And yet, amid the sorrow, there was tenderness. Chronicles speak of noble families funding hospitals, not just for salvation, but for mercy. Priests and monks offered blessings and absolution to the dying, believing that spiritual healing mattered as much as physical care. Those who donated generously to leper houses believed they were redeeming their souls, purchasing prayers to be said for them long after their deaths. In some illuminated manuscripts, lepers are depicted kneeling before saints' halos of gold shining above their heads, a visual reminder that these outcasts were not beyond God's reach. Leprosy reshaped medieval life in countless ways. Cities built hospitals at their gates, often marked by symbols of the cross and a carved bell so travelers knew where the afflicted stayed. Some towns held processions for lepers, blessing them before formally declaring them dead to the world. This strange ritual symbolized their separation from society. The leper knelt in a church, dressed in a shroud, while a priest sprinkled holy water and recited funeral prayers. When the ceremony ended, the leper walked out, not as a member of the living community, but as one already counted among the dead. Despite the rituals, despite the reverence, life expectancy for a leper was tragically low, not because the disease itself was always fatal, but because it weakened the immune system, leaving victims vulnerable to other illnesses, like tuberculosis or diphtheria. Death often came quietly without drama, as if the disease had already stolen all the fight from its host. Graves for lepers were dug away from towns, often in consecrated fields near monasteries. Today, archaeologists uncover these cemeteries and marvel at the care taken to bury those who had been cast out in life. The story of leprosy is one of contrasts: fear and compassion, isolation and sanctuary, reverence and revulsion. In medieval art and writing, lepers are both symbols of divine suffering and grim reminders of mortality. Their bells became part of the medieval soundscape, just as familiar as the tolling of church bells at dawn and dusk. The disease spread through Europe for centuries, shaping laws, architecture, and even the medieval imagination. As time passes, in our journey, we leave behind the slow, sorrowful toll of the leper's bell and step into a new kind of fear. For centuries, another illness would haunt Europe's memories: smallpox, the speckled monster, a sickness that scarred faces and claimed lives at a terrifying pace. Where leprosy crept slowly, smallpox struck like lightning, leaving scars as its signature, a warning etched into the skin of survivors. The leper's bell echoes faintly through winding alleys, a sound that once froze villagers in place. Imagine a narrow medieval street at dusk, timber houses leaning close as if whispering secrets, crooked chimneys exhaling thin plumes of smoke. Lanterns sway in the wind, their dim glow barely cutting through mist, rising from gutters where filth collects in stagnant pools. In this eerie half-light, a cloaked figure approaches a hood, shadowing their face. They move slowly, deliberately, a wooden staff striking the cobblestones at each step. The bell tied to their wrist chimes softly, warning the healthy to retreat. People draw back into doorways. Mothers pull children close, and even dogs slink away. This sound is both a plea for mercy and a symbol of doom. Leprosy was not a quick executioner. It was a sculptor, carving away the body, over years leaving its victims as haunting reminders of mortality. The illness begins invisibly: fatigue, faint numbness. In fingertips, a pale patch of skin, mistaken for a bruise. Slowly it spreads through the nerves, dulling pain, until injuries go unnoticed. Burns, cuts, or broken bones are felt only when infection sets in. Fingers stiffen, toes curl, and cartilage recedes. The nose sinks inward, leaving a flattened visage that becomes the disease's signature mask. Faces became maps of suffering, but for centuries, few understood what caused it. To many, leprosy was not merely an illness, it was divine judgment. In monasteries, priests spoke of sufferers as holy martyrs, enduring purgatory on earth, their pain an imitation of Christ's own suffering. This belief granted lepers a strange reverence, despised for their appearance, yet honored for the burden they carried. Nobles donated to hospitals called leprosaria, hoping that acts of charity would earn them a place in heaven. These sanctuaries sprang up outside city gates, marked by carved crosses and bells. Within their walls, monks cared for the afflicted, washing wounds in wine, anointing them with oil, and offering simple meals. Patients slept in shared halls, candlelight flickering over lined faces as the scent of herbs and smoke filled the cool stone corridors. For many, entering a leprosarium was like attending one's own funeral. In a chilling ritual, a leper could be declared dead to the world. In a solemn ceremony, they knelt in a church dressed in a shroud, while priests sprinkled holy water and intoned prayers for the dead. When the service ended, they walked out, as though resurrected, but marked alive yet separated forever from society. From that moment on, they lived beyond city walls, their world reduced to simple huts, gardens of healing herbs and daily prayers. Still, not all treatment was merciful. Fear ran deep, and suspicion followed every blemish. Villagers accused neighbors of sin or sorcery, whispering that the disease was punishment for greed or lust. Some lepers were banished, entirely wandering roadsides with only their bells for company. The sound of their approach sent shivers down the spines of travelers. Many threw coins or bread into the dust rather than come near. Children were told never to look at a leper's face too long, lest they catch the curse through a glance. And yet, despite this fear, stories of compassion survived. Chronicles speak of monks who cradled dying patients in their arms, priests who kissed the foreheads of lepers to show God's love, and noble women who funded entire hospitals to provide shelter and food. Some of the era's most beautiful illuminated manuscripts depict lepers with golden halos above their heads, as if suffering had sanctified them. These images reveal a paradox at the heart of medieval faith. The same people society exiled were also revered as living icons of divine endurance. Life inside a leprosarium was quiet but full of ritual. Bells rang at dawn and dusk, summoning patients to prayer. Gardens bloomed with medicinal herbs, sage thyme and rosemary, whose fragrance offered some comfort in the air thick with disease. Patients learned to care for one another, dressing wounds, cooking meals, and tending livestock. Though they were separated from family and friends, these communities became surrogate families of their own. The bonds formed there were deep and often tender proof that even in exile, humanity persisted. Archaeological digs near medieval hospitals tell stories that words cannot. Graves show evidence of careful burials, bodies wrapped neatly, rosaries still clutched in skeletal hands. In some cemeteries, hundreds of lepers rest beneath simple wooden crosses, buried just outside the walls of the cities that once shunned them. The care evident in these burials speaks volumes about the compassion woven into medieval faith, even when fear was overwhelming. Centuries passed, but leprosy remained a shadow on Europe's conscience. Travelers wrote of entire villages populated solely by the afflicted, their huts forming eerie hamlets where laughter was rare and bells chimed at every hour. In manuscripts, artists painted lepers crouched on roadsides, hands outstretched for alms, their faces solemn yet serene. Some paintings even depicted Christ himself as a leper, a striking reminder that those who suffered were closer to the divine. This imagery softened hearts, encouraging donations and pilgrimages to hospitals dedicated to their care. Leprosy's grip on medieval imagination was profound. Plays and sermons used it as a moral lesson. Literature compared spiritual corruption to leprosy eating away at the soul. Yet in reality, the disease spread far less easily than people feared. Only prolonged close contact could transmit it, and even then, some were naturally resistant. Science would not uncover the truth until centuries later, when Mycobacterium leprae was identified in 873. But by then, leprosy had already shaped centuries of architecture, art, and faith. Today, the ruins of medieval leper hospitals remain scattered across Europe, ivy creeping over crumbling stone walls. Visitors wander through quiet cloisters, where once candles flickered over the dying, where bells rang softly in the still night air. These ruins are monuments not just to disease, but to resilience and care, to a time when fear and compassion walked hand in hand. As we leave behind the sound of the leper's bell, the road ahead grows darker still, for the next illness in our journey was not slow or contemplative, but swift and merciless. It left its mark on the skin-carved scars into history and terrified entire generations. Survivors bore its signature forever on their faces, while the unlucky lay in shallow graves. This was smallpox, the speckled monster, the red plague, that turned hope to despair in a matter of days. Night settles over a medieval town, the kind built in tight spirals of cobblestone streets and wooden homes stacked close together, their upper floors leaning out as though whispering secrets to each other. The air smells faintly of smoke and hay, with a sharp undercurrent of damp earth after rain. Inside these homes, candles flicker low, casting golden halos across stone hearths. In one quiet room, a mother leans over her feverish child, brushing damp hair back from a flushed face. The heat of his skin startles her, like touching the surface of a kettle left too long on the fire. She dips a cloth in cool water, whispering prayers she learned as a girl, her voice trembling as she sees faint red spots blooming along his cheeks and neck. The child stirs, murmuring in a fever dream, his small fists clutching the blanket tightly. Smallpox arrived like a thief in the night. It needed no ceremony, no announcement. Soldiers returning from distant crusades brought it home carrying the disease in their blood, their skin, and their breath. At first, it was mistaken for a common fever, but within days, its true nature revealed itself in the unmistakable rash that spread like wildfire over the body. The illness was relentless. High fever, vomiting chills, and then the slow, steady eruption of pustules, each filled with thick, cloudy fluid. The smell of infection clung to the air, heavy and sour, while sufferers moaned softly, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. In villages, fear spread faster than the disease itself. Parents would wrap their children in layers of cloth, hoping to protect them, but the illness was merciless, leaping from one household to another, as if guided by unseen hands. The rash deepened into angry red blisters that hardened like tiny pearls under the skin. Days later, they would dry and scab, but the scars left behind were permanent, a visible reminder of survival, etched like ink across a lifetime. Those who lived bore these marks with quiet pride, while many others never left their sickbeds at all. In bustling cities, outbreaks brought chaos. The narrow streets reeked of fear as carts rolled through neighborhoods, carrying away the bodies of those who had succumbed. The wails of grieving families echoed through open windows, mingling with the church bells, tolling endlessly for the dead. Priests moved among the sick, murmuring prayers and anointing foreheads, their courage a small light in the darkness. Apothecaries offered poultices of herbs, baths in vinegar, and concoctions of honey and wine, none of which could halt the disease's progress. Still, families clung to hope, lighting candles to saints hanging charms above doors, whispering pleas that their loved ones might be spared. Smallpox earned many names over the centuries: the speckled monster, the red plague, God's punishment. It showed no mercy, striking rich and poor alike. Kings and queens bore its scars. Some never lived to see adulthood. In dimly lit chambers, noble physicians attempted desperate cures, bleeding, purging, and fumigation with pungent herbs that choked the air. Yet nothing stemmed the tide. Even the wealthy learned that no amount of gold could stop this invisible enemy. In the countryside, fear took on a quieter shape. Families isolated themselves in cottages, sealing shutters and doors, avoiding market days. Villages fell silent as travelers shunned one another, wary of strangers carrying sickness on their breath. For those who survived, the relief was bittersweet. Children emerged from the ordeal with pitted scars that marked them for life, reminders of the fever dreams that haunted their nights. Parents thanked God for their survival, but carried the weight of neighbors lost and loved ones buried in hastily dug graves. The disease's reach stretched across continents, changing history in its wake. Crusaders returning from campaigns in the East unknowingly carried smallpox back to Europe. Trade ships spread it further, delivering its devastation to ports already burdened by poverty and filth. Entire generations grew up with its specter hanging over them, a silent, constant threat woven into the fabric of life. Its impact was so great that in some places, mothers prayed for their children to catch the disease young, believing that survival in childhood meant safety in adulthood. As centuries passed, smallpox became a grim part of medieval existence, like famine and war. Its scars became almost a badge of endurance, proof of a battle fought and survived. In manuscripts, artists painted saints, comforting children, covered in sores, halos glowing above their suffering heads. Priests wrote of smallpox as both a punishment and a purification, a disease that tested faith and humility. Yet for all the devotion, all the whispered prayers and candlelit vigils, the disease remained unrelenting, its power undiminished. The shadow of smallpox stretches far beyond this medieval world. It would take centuries of suffering before science found a way to banish the monster for good. But in these candlelit streets, in the cold chambers of castles, and the smoky cottages of peasants, it reigned supreme. And as we drift deeper into this journey, the roads ahead lead us toward an even darker story, an illness that tore through Europe with a swiftness that defied belief, leaving madness and shame in its wake. The great pox, they called it, syphilis. a disease so feared, so devastating, that even its whispers could ruin reputations and bring nations to their knees. The memory of smallpox clung to medieval life like a heavy fog. In towns where outbreaks struck, people spoke of it in hushed voices, as though naming it aloud might summon it again. The disease's rhythm was predictable, yet terrifying: fever and chills on the first day, vomiting by the second, and then the slow, dreadful bloom of spots across the skin. Mothers knew the signs well. They'd seen neighbors' children vanish within weeks, carried away under woolen shrouds. The smell of sickness filled entire streets, an acrid mix of sweat, rotting scabs, and herbal smoke from desperate attempts to cleanse the air. In the cramped quarters of a peasant's cottage, families gathered around hearth fires, watching over their loved ones with wide, sleepless eyes. Straw pallets lined the dirt floor, and the flicker of the fire cast soft, moving shadows on the wooden beams above. Parents dipped rags in cold water, pressing them gently against fevered brows, whispering lullabies through tears. In some homes, the sick were left in near-darkness windows, shuttered tightly to ward off spirits or drafts believed to worsen the disease. Herbal charms hung above doorways, sprigs of rosemary and sage bound with twine, tokens of hope against an unseen enemy. For wealthier households, the scene was not much brighter. Noble families brought physicians, astrologers, and apothecaries to the bedside, their gold coins buying elaborate but useless treatments. Doctors in long robes studied the stars, believing planetary misalignment caused the outbreak. Others prescribed purges to cleanse the body, bleeding patients with silver knives, or bathing them in vinegar and rosewater to draw out the poison. Servants worked tirelessly, stoking fires, boiling water, and fumigating chambers with sharp-smelling herbs like wormwood and juniper. Yet despite the bustle, the mortality rate remained devastating. Church bells tolled endlessly, their low, somber notes rolling across cobblestone streets like waves of sorrow. Priests traveled from house to house, anointing the dying, offering confessions and blessings as families gathered around beds. Death was not a stranger in this world. Even so, smallpox brought fear of a different kind. It was a disease that scarred both body and memory, leaving survivors forever marked, their faces pitted like worn stone walls. The sight of those scars became a reminder for entire communities, a living warning of the monster that once swept through their homes. Graveyards filled quickly, and burial customs shifted under the pressure. In smaller towns, funerals grew hurried and less ceremonial as priests struggled to keep pace with the dead. Bodies were wrapped in plain linen and lowered into shallow graves, prayers spoken quickly as new carts of the dead arrived. In cities, mass graves were dug, beyond the walls the earth disturbed, so often that the scent of freshly turned soil lingered for weeks. This reality was woven deeply into medieval consciousness, shaping their understanding of life, death, and faith. Children grew up accustomed to loss, and yet they also grew up resilient. Their lullabies often prayers, their first memories often lit by candlelight and the tolling of bells. Travelers wrote vivid accounts of towns ravaged by smallpox. Merchants arriving at new ports sometimes found streets eerily quiet, market stalls abandoned, and inns shuttered. In some regions, entire families perished, their homes left locked and untouched as though frozen in time. Carts of goods sat rotting in courtyards and letters went undelivered because no one remained to read them. These scenes left lasting impressions, becoming cautionary tales retold around campfires and in church sermons. The disease didn't just scar bodies, it haunted imaginations. In monasteries, monks carefully recorded outbreaks chronicling symptoms and deaths with meticulous precision. Illuminated manuscripts depicted the disease with solemn artistry, saints bending over the sick angels, carrying souls upward, while families wept below. These records offer us glimpses of life. Then, the hush of candlelit halls, the smell of ink and parchment mingled with incense, the soft chants of monks as they worked tirelessly to care for the afflicted. While medicine as we know it was centuries away, compassion was abundant. The monks' gentle hands and quiet prayers often brought more comfort than any remedy could. Among the poor, superstition thrived. Some believed the disease was sent by God as punishment for sin. Others thought it was caused by evil spirits or curses cast by witches. Protective charms became common: tiny bags of herbs worn around the neck, small relics from saints tucked under pillows, crosses carved into wooden doors. In rural villages, entire communities gathered in churches to hold all-night vigils, candles burning bright, while voices rose in soft, mournful hymns. The flickering lights cast golden halos on stone walls, and the smell of beeswax and incense mingled with the thick scent of fear. Survivors of smallpox carried its legacy in every glance. In a time when beauty was often equated with purity, a face scarred by the disease could shape a life's path. Some wore veils to hide their scars, while others embraced them as proof of divine favor, a sign they had been spared. Chroniclers wrote of queens and noble women who ruled with faces marked by smallpox, their power undiminished by scars that became part of their legend. In this way, the disease shaped not just bodies, but politics and culture, leaving its fingerprints on history. Yet even as it ravaged Europe, smallpox was already an ancient adversary, its presence traced back through centuries of human migration. Traders and crusaders spread it across continents, weaving it into the fabric of daily life. Children grew up under its shadow. Mothers whispered warnings to their newborns, and entire generations learned to fear the first signs of a high fever. Smallpox became so expected that families sometimes viewed early infection as a grim blessing. Better to survive as a child and carry scars than to meet the disease as an adult and die. As the medieval world trudged forward through centuries of plague, famine, and war, smallpox remained a constant companion, a reminder of how fragile life was. In dimly lit rooms across Europe, the ritual of care rarely changed: a mother's soft voice soothing her feverish child, a father pacing near the door, a priest kneeling in prayer, and a flickering candle standing vigil over them all. That image, the simple act of keeping watch, was a universal language of love and fear. Eventually, whispers of hope began to emerge in faraway lands. In Asia, rudimentary inoculation practices hinted at humanity's slow awakening to science. Tales of powdered scabs blown into nostrils or scratches rubbed with pus from mild cases traveled along trade routes, sparking curiosity and skepticism in equal measure. Though Europe would not see the full triumph over smallpox until centuries later, These whispers planted seeds of knowledge that would one day bloom into salvation. For now, however, the medieval mind could not comprehend such things. To them, disease was a spiritual struggle, a mystery locked in the heavens. The story of smallpox in the Middle Ages is not just a tale of suffering, it is also a portrait of resilience. Communities rallied together, neighbors cared for one another, and even in their fear, people found ways to honor the sick and dead. Through every outbreak, humanity clung to rituals that brought meaning to their pain: the soft toll of bells, the lighting of candles, the smell of incense drifting upward like prayers carried to God. These rituals became armor for the soul, proof that even in the face of death, life had dignity. And now, as we leave behind the narrow alleys lined with shuttered windows, we follow the echoes of history into a darker chapter still. Ahead lies a disease that carried shame as heavily as pain, one that marked its victims not only physically, but socially, staining reputations and destroying families. This was syphilis, the great pox, a sickness that swept across Europe with a ferocity unmatched, rewriting love stories, poisoning royal bloodlines, and changing medicine forever. The flicker of candlelight seems dimmer now as we step into this shadowed tale, where the line between disease and morality blurred beyond recognition. The night is heavy with fog, the kind that softens torchlight and muffles sound. In the narrow streets of Naples, in the late 15th century, whispers pass quickly from mouth to mouth, murmurs of a strange new sickness spreading through the city. Soldiers returning from campaigns wander taverns and alleyways, their armor dulled by travel, their laughter subdued by unease. This was a city accustomed to trade and travelers, but something about these rumors feels different, sharper, more dangerous. People speak of sudden sores of flesh, turning raw and painful, of fevers that burn like a furnace, and madness that creeps into the mind. Soon, the name begins to take hold. The great pox, syphilis, emerged like a phantom from the chaos of war. In 1490, during the French invasion of Naples, mercenary armies from across Europe marched through Italy, bringing with them a sickness that spread rapidly among soldiers and civilians alike. Its symptoms were shocking, unlike anything most had seen before: ulcerous sores that erupted over the body, painful pustules oozing green fluid, and a stench so foul that even physicians recoiled. The disease did not discriminate. Kings, merchants, soldiers, and peasants fell ill alike, their skin marked with angry weeping lesions that turned faces into masks of suffering. To a society steeped in religious symbolism, this was no mere sickness. It was judgment made flesh. By the time the disease swept north through Europe, it had already earned dozens of names. Italians called it the French disease, blaming the invading army. The French, in turn, referred to it as the Neapolitan disease. Spaniards and Germans each named it after their enemies, proof of how fear turned suspicion outward. But beneath the political insults was real terror. Unlike plague, which killed quickly, syphilis tortured its victims, slowly changing form as the months passed. Early lesions hardened into chancre sores that left deep scars, followed by fever-swollen lymph nodes and eruptions across the body. Survivors of this first wave carried the disease silently, passing it unknowingly to lovers, spouses, and unborn children. In the flickering candlelight of medieval bedchambers, the disease moved quietly from one body to another, an invisible traveler. Some victims never developed full symptoms, others became walking warnings, their skin covered in scabs, their faces ravaged their minds, slipping into madness as the disease advanced. Physicians lacking understanding turned to astrology and alchemy for answers. Charts of the stars were consulted, leeches were applied, and patients were purged with strong emetics that left them weak and trembling. Bloodletting was common, physicians insisting that the sickness was caused by corruption of humors, an imbalance that could be restored only by draining life itself. Mercury became the treatment of choice. Apothecaries prepared unguents of quicksilver, rubbing the toxic metal into open sores. Victims sat in mercury vapor baths, inhaling poisonous fumes that left their gums ulcerated and their teeth falling out. The saying, "A night in the arms of Venus leads to a lifetime on Mercury," became a grim joke among physicians. Though there was nothing humorous about the suffering, Mercury caused trembling, drooling, and organ failure. But it was one of the few treatments that occasionally slowed the disease's march. People were so desperate for relief that they endured its agony willingly. As the 16th century dawned, syphilis was everywhere. Its symptoms changed over time, becoming less deadly, but more insidious. Some historians believe the disease mutated rapidly, transforming from a swift and devastating killer into a slow-moving affliction that lingered for years. Nobility, who once flaunted their beauty, now hid behind veils and makeup to mask lesions and scars. Artists painted portraits that flattered their patrons, smoothing over pockmarks. But in reality, the disease stalked even royal courts. Rumors spread that kings and queens bore the illness, and whispers of scandal clung to noble families for generations. In villages, fear was quieter, but no less sharp. Lovers exchanged glances in candlelit cottages, each touch now laced with dread. Midwives delivered infants, marked by the sickness, their tiny bodies already scarred. Some communities believed syphilis was a punishment for moral corruption, linking it to lust and sin. This belief brought shame that compounded the disease's suffering. Victims not only endured physical pain, but social exile. Women accused of promiscuity, men suspected of infidelity, all became scapegoats for a sickness no one understood. Churches preached sermons about virtue, warning that the wages of sin were visible in the sores of the infected. Yet the disease did not care for morality. Priests, nuns, and even physicians fell ill proof that virtue offered no shield. In monasteries, monks recorded its horrors in careful script ink, staining parchment with words of despair. Medical texts from this era describe the illness in grotesque detail, illustrations showing sores blooming like flowers over limbs and faces. One physician wrote that the disease eats away at the flesh like a slow fire, and such imagery echoed through generations, shaping syphilis into a symbol of decay. Cities became laboratories of suffering. Apothecaries offered remedies of powdered pearl gold leaf dissolved in vinegar, and potions of rare spices from distant lands. Wealthy patients submitted themselves to elaborate cures, hoping exotic ingredients could banish their pain. Some believed that traveling to warm climates would sweat out the disease, prompting nobles to flee cities for Mediterranean retreats, only to carry the sickness with them. It was a time of desperation, when every whispered rumor of a cure was clutched like a lifeline. The great pox influenced art and literature profoundly. In paintings, the Virgin Mary was sometimes depicted as a healer, extending a compassionate hand toward those covered in sores. Plays and ballads carried moral lessons warning against temptation and excess, using the disease as a cautionary tale. Yet beneath the moralizing, there was empathy. Chroniclers described families who refused to abandon their sick, tending to them until the end, their love stronger than fear. In dimly lit homes, wives held their husbands' trembling hands. Mothers rocked feverish children, and candles burned low beside beds, where time seemed to stretch endlessly. As the disease progressed to its later stages, madness often followed. Syphilis attacked the brain as stealthily as it did the body. Patients once known for sharp wit began to speak incoherently, their minds unraveling. Musicians lost their ability to play scholars, forgot their own writings, and rulers made erratic decisions that altered the course of kingdoms. The line between disease and curse blurred, feeding superstition. Some claimed demons whispered in the ears of the infected. Others believed they were seeing visions of purgatory. But even in its cruelty, syphilis inspired advances in medicine. Physicians began to study its progression, carefully comparing cases, recording treatments, and seeking patterns. The disease forced a shift in how doctors understood contagion and the human body, though centuries would pass before effective treatments emerged. These early observations laid the groundwork for future discoveries. It is a strange twist of fate that one of the darkest plagues of the Renaissance became a teacher nudging medicine closer to science. We can almost hear the echo of a lute playing softly in a noble's chamber, a melody mingling with the scent of incense and beeswax candles. Outside, snow falls silently over cobblestones, muffling the world, while inside a man sits hunched in a velvet chair, his face pale, his breath shallow. His once proud hands tremble as a physician applies mercury ointment, the sharp metallic smell filling the room. The treatment burns, but he endures it in silence. His servants exchange worried glances, but no one speaks. The disease is as much a shadow over his name as over his body, and reputation matters as much as survival. Across Europe, countless similar scenes played out in humble cottages and palaces alike. The Great Pox was an equalizer indifferent to wealth or power. It lingered in whispers and scars, in the hush of candlelit rooms where lovers grieved and families mourned. Its reach extended through generations, its stigma lasting long after the pustules had healed. Even centuries later, when antibiotics would finally break its grip, the disease's history remained a haunting mirror of fear, morality, and desire. And so we drift onward, leaving behind dimly lit chambers filled with incense and whippers, stepping back into the bustling streets of a world where disease was everywhere. The cobblestones glisten with rain, merchants call out their wares, and somewhere a bell tolls softly. Ahead lies the Black Death itself, the terror that swept like wildfire across Europe, transforming every life it touched. The road grows darker now as we follow the shadow of death into the heart of the 14th century, where plague ships docked in silence and rats carried doom in their fur. The disease moved not only through cities and palaces, but also through taverns and countryside inns, spreading in ways the medieval mind could not yet grasp. Merchants, traveling between ports, carried it unknowingly, their skin showing no sign of infection until weeks later when the first sores appeared, like bruised petals blossoming across their bodies. Sailors whispered about the curse of foreign lands, blaming distant shores for a sickness that clung to them like a ghost. Some claimed it was brought back from the New World by men who sailed with Columbus, a sinister reminder that exploration often carried invisible dangers. The disease followed trade routes as faithfully as spices and silk, embedding itself deep within Europe's veins. In coastal towns, suspicion grew heavy. Foreign sailors were eyed warily, and tavern keepers became reluctant hosts, though their coin purses demanded they welcome strangers. Doctors roamed with satchels of herbs and tinctures, their knowledge limited, but their curiosity sharp. The journals they kept are haunting pages, filled with careful ink, sketches of lesions, notes on fevers and madness, diagrams of bodies ravaged beyond recognition. These manuscripts, now faded and brittle, are windows into a world where medicine was as much art as science, and each page is steeped in fear and fascination. As the 16th century deepened, syphilis evolved its early fury, softening into a slower burn, where once it killed within months, it now lingered for years, weaving itself into lives and lineages. This slower form allowed the disease to hide in plain sight. A nobleman might appear healthy, smiling in portraits commissioned by famous artists, but beneath the silk and velvet, the illness was eating away at his bones and nerves. Some rulers were rumored to have gone mad, not from ambition, but from syphilis's cruel assault on the brain. The disease became both a physical scourge and a symbol, a reminder that power and wealth offered no protection against the frailties of the human body. In cities like Paris and London, apothecaries' shops overflowed with remedies. Bottles lined wooden shelves, powders of pearl and coral syrups infused with saffron and cinnamon ointments thick with mercury. The metallic smell of quicksilver filled treatment rooms, mingling with the sweet smoke of incense burned to mask the stench of rotting flesh. Wealthy patients could afford week-long treatments in steaming mercury baths, sweating and shivering, while attendants fanned them with feathered fans to keep them from fainting. The mercury was believed to purge poison from the body, but often it poisoned more than it cured. Patients emerged, gaunt and trembling, their gums bleeding their teeth, loosening their hair, falling out, yet hope made them return for more. Meanwhile, the poor endured the disease in silence. In cramped, smoky cottages, families huddled together, watching loved ones waste away. Mothers sang soft lullabies to infants born already marked by syphilis, their cries weak and pained. Husbands and wives exchanged quiet glances, shame mingling with sorrow as they realized their suffering would soon claim them both. There was little judgment among the poor. Survival was too immediate a struggle. Yet, outside their walls, society whispered cruelly. The disease was tied to immorality, and victims were often branded sinners regardless of circumstance. Prostitutes were blamed openly, hunted down, and humiliated, though they were often victims themselves. Religious fervor rose in response. Preachers thundered from pulpits declaring syphilis a punishment for lust and decadence. Cities held public processions of repentance, with barefoot penitents marching through streets carrying candles and crosses, chanting prayers for divine mercy. Artists immortalized these scenes in paintings where halos glowed over the faithful, contrasting with the sores and scars of the sick. Some churches became sanctuaries for victims, their stone halls echoing with hymns and muffled sobs. Monks washed wounds, gently their hands steady despite the stench of disease. In these acts of mercy, the medieval soul found solace even when the body could not be saved. The great pox changed love and intimacy in ways subtle and profound. Courting became cautious veils, and gloves served not only as fashion, but as protection. Nobility married strategically, but whispers of illness could ruin an alliance before vows were ever spoken. Lovers exchanged tokens of affection, rings, ribbons, portraits, but their embraces were shadowed by fear. In literature, stories of tragic romance multiplied, reflecting a society haunted by the unseen dangers of passion. Poets wrote of kisses, carrying death of beauty, masking decay, and of love cursed by invisible demons. Physicians, too, changed under syphilis's influence. They began to observe patterns. The disease progressed in stages, moving from sores to rashes to bone pain, and finally madness. This observation marked a turning point in medicine, a shift from superstition toward careful documentation. Some of the earliest medical illustrations of syphilis come from this period, hand-painted images of lesions and deformities, not meant to shock, but to teach. These drawings, preserved in libraries, are stark reminders of humanity's attempt to understand suffering, even when answers remained elusive. As we walk these cobblestone streets in our imagination, the world of syphilis becomes clearer. Picture a candlelit apothecary, its shelves heavy with glass jars and bundles of herbs hanging from rafters. The air is thick with the scent of rosemary, lavender, and something sharper, mercury, the alchemist's metal. A young woman sits on a wooden stool, her face pale, a scarf tied carefully under her chin to hide a sore near her mouth. The apothecary dips a cloth into a bowl of mercury ointment and applies it gently. She winces, but says nothing. Outside, the night is alive with music from taverns, but inside this room, silence reigns. The disease has stolen her health, and soon perhaps her life. Yet in this moment, hope flickers like the candles lining the shelf. Syphilis did not just devastate individuals, it reshaped entire societies. In Spain, royal bloodlines became tainted, their legacies intertwined with the disease. In France, scandalous rumors about mistresses and kings whispered through court corridors, adding intrigue to already fragile politics. In England, suspicion of foreign visitors deepened, leading to stricter regulations at ports and inns. The disease's reach was so pervasive that it altered diplomacy. Ambassadors and travelers were sometimes scrutinized as much for their health as their words. Over time, the great pox became part of daily life's background hum, like the tolling of church bells or the rattle of cartwheels over stone. It was a quiet terror, an enemy you couldn't see until it bloomed on your skin. For artists, it was a muse of sorrow. Paintings of suffering saints often echoed the sores of syphilis victims, blurring the line between spiritual and physical agony. In manuscripts, illuminated borders filled with flowers and vines framed grim depictions of pustules, as if nature itself reflected the disease's strange beauty and horror. By the 17th century, syphilis had woven itself into folklore. Tales circulated of cursed lovers and demons disguised as beautiful strangers. Mothers warned daughters about men with charming smiles, and fathers cautioned sons about the dangers of taverns and brothels. The disease became a moral compass, a cautionary tale used to shape behavior. Yet beneath these superstitions was a growing curiosity. Alchemists experimented with distillations and metals, laying groundwork for chemistry's birth. Syphilis became both a symbol of sin and a stepping stone towards science. Imagine walking through a Renaissance palace in this era. The corridors are lined with paintings of ancestors, their gazes regal and solemn, yet some faces bear faint scars, smoothed over by the painter's careful hand. Behind heavy velvet curtains, a chamber is filled with the sharp tang of burning incense. A nobleman lies in bed, his skin pale, his breath shallow as a physician checks his pulse. The man's wife kneels nearby, whispering prayers, her rosary beads clutched so tightly they leave imprints in her fingers. The room is heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Outside, snow falls softly on the palace gardens, muffling the world beyond these walls. Inside, the shadow of syphilis lingers like a ghost. The disease's cruelty was not always obvious. Years could pass between its stages, allowing victims to believe they were cured. Some rebuilt their lives only to be struck down later by bone pain blindness or madness. Physicians began to notice these relapses, deepening their understanding of disease progression. This slow awakening to patterns marked a turning point in medical history. Though centuries away from penicillin, these early physicians planted seeds of observation and curiosity that would one day bear fruit. As time drifts onward, the great pox fades into memory, but its influence lingers in art, science, and culture. Its legacy is a paradox, a symbol of shame and sin, yet also a catalyst for change. The disease forced humanity to confront mortality, morality, and the limits of medicine. It left scars not only on bodies, but on the collective consciousness of Europe, shaping generations of fear, compassion, and innovation. We step away now from the candlelit chambers of nobles and the smoky cottages of peasants, from the scent of mercury and incense, from the whisper of rumors that shaped royal courts. Ahead lies a plague far more devastating one that arrived like a storm and reshaped the world in just a few years. This was the Black Death, a tide of terror that swept across continents, leaving silence where cities once thrived. The road ahead is darker, still lined with mass graves and abandoned villages, but it is also illuminated by stories of resilience and survival. As we drift closer to the mid-14th century, we follow the creak of plague ships, docking at silent harbors, the scurrying of rats in the shadows, and the low hum of fear that settled over an entire world. The wind over the Black Sea carries the scent of salt and smoke, mingling with the faint stench of decay from ships anchored offshore. The year is 1347, and in the bustling Crimean port of Kaffa, merchants and sailors go about their business with unease. At the edge of the city, Mongol forces lay siege, their catapults launching not stones, but something far more sinister. Bodies swollen and blackened, hurled over the city walls. The defenders watch into horror as these corpses crash onto rooftops, scattering clouds of flies. Within days, sickness creeps through Kaffa's streets. No one realizes yet that fleas, hidden in the matted fur of rats, are carrying death into every corner of the world. Soon after, a dozen ships leave the besieged port, their sails catching the wind like pale wings. On board, Italian merchants cough weakly in dim cabins, their bodies covered in black, oozing swellings, buboes that pulse with infection. As the ships dock at Messina in Sicily, dock workers recoil at the sight. Sailors stagger down gangplanks, their eyes glassy, their breath shallow, their skin marred by bruises, as if ink stains have bloomed beneath it. Some die before their feet touch the harbor. The ships are ordered away, but the damage is already done. In the alleyways of Messina, fleas leap from rats, hitching rides on travelers and goods, and the Black Death begins its march through Europe. The disease spreads like wildfire through narrow, filthy streets, where sewage runs in open gutters and refuse piles against wooden doors. In the cities, people live shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same stale air, drinking water drawn from contaminated wells. Within days of exposure, fever grips its victims, followed by chills and unbearable pain in the armpits and groin, where black swellings rise beneath the skin. These buboes are tender to the touch, filled with pus and blood, throbbing like a second heartbeat. Some victims bleed from their noses and mouths, vomiting blood in fits of agony. Others are overcome by delirium, their minds breaking under the fever's relentless assault. The smell of death settles over Europe like a heavy cloak. Bell towers ring constantly, their somber tones echoing across rooftops. Priests and monks walk barefoot through cobblestone streets, chanting prayers and swinging censers, filled with incense to purify the air. But the disease is faster than prayer. Within a single year, entire towns are emptied, their market squares silent, their taverns shuttered. Survivors bury the dead in hurried, shallow graves, often without ceremony, as there are not enough hands left to dig. In some places, carts piled high with bodies creak through the streets at dawn, accompanied by men whose faces are covered with cloth soaked in vinegar. The sight becomes so common that people stop looking. The plague is merciless, sparing neither nobles nor peasants. Castles become prisons as lords retreat behind fortified walls, their servants instructed to burn herbs and carry vinegar-soaked cloths. Yet even wealth cannot buy safety. Chronicles tell of entire noble families struck down within days, their riches abandoned in halls now haunted by silence. In villages, the devastation is even more stark. Empty cottages, fields left untended, and livestock wandering freely without shepherds to guide them. Wolves creep closer to abandoned farmsteads, their howls echoing in the still night. Fear transforms daily life. Neighbors no longer greet one another. Parents avoid touching their children, terrified of passing on the sickness. In some towns, strangers are hunted and blamed for spreading disease, and rumors circulate of wells poisoned by foreigners or witches. Public trust unravels, friendships dissolve into suspicion. Yet amid this fear, acts of bravery stand out: priests entering homes to comfort the dying women, tending to neighbors even when it means their own doom. These quiet acts of love become lanterns in the darkness. The plague mutates as it spreads. The bubonic form carried by fleas gives way to a pneumonic strain that infects the lungs, making the disease airborne. Now, a single cough can carry death to anyone nearby. Pneumonic plague kills swiftly, often within a day or two of the first fever. Families die together, their homes sealed by neighbors who fear to enter. In some cities, the dead outnumber the living so greatly that streets are lined with corpses stacked like firewood, waiting for carts that never arrive. As winter falls, snow covers the ground like a shroud, but the cold does not bring relief. Rats scurry through empty marketplaces, their tiny claws scratching on frozen wood, carrying fleas that leap from carcasses to new hosts. Even monasteries, once seen as sanctuaries, are not spared. Monks who once prayed over the dying now lie silent in rows, their manuscripts left unfinished, ink drying in their quills. The great centers of learning fall quiet, their cloisters echoing only with the rustle of rats' tails. The psychological toll is immense. Survivors speak of a world turned upside down. Doctors dressed in long black robes and bird-like masks, stuffed with aromatic herbs, become eerie figures, moving through silent streets, their canes used to prod patients from a distance. The plague doctor becomes a grim symbol of the era, immortalized in woodcuts and paintings. Art shifts dramatically, reflecting the horror of the time. Skeletal figures dance alongside peasants and nobles in the danse macabre, reminding all that death spares no one. Frescoes depict angels weeping, demons lurking, and villages swallowed by shadow. Even in rural areas where isolation once meant safety, the plague finds its way. Farmers return from market days, unknowingly infected, and within weeks, entire hamlets are gone. Livestock roam freely, untended fields grow wild, and church bells fall silent because no one remains to ring them. Wolves and bears creep closer to villages, reclaiming spaces once filled with human voices. Forest paths become overgrown as trade routes falter. The very rhythm of medieval life planting, harvesting market days festivals, comes to a halt, replaced by an endless cycle of fear and mourning. And yet, amid this devastation, resilience blooms like a stubborn flower in winter. Some communities rally together, organizing burial teams, setting up makeshift hospitals, and creating systems of quarantine. Neighbors care for orphans, monasteries open their gates to the sick, and women trained in herbal medicine become lifelines for their villages. The human spirit, even crushed under the weight of so much loss, proves difficult to extinguish. The plague lasts years, waves crashing upon Europe with merciless regularity. From 1347 to 1351, an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population perishes, some say closer to half. England alone loses entire towns. France's countryside is dotted with abandoned farmhouses, their wooden beams collapsing into the soil. In Italy, bustling cities like Florence are reduced to hushed ruins, their once lively piazzas filled with the hum of flies over mass graves. But when the plague finally recedes, it leaves behind a transformed society. Labor shortages reshape the medieval world. With so many peasants gone, survivors find their work in high demand, earning better wages and more freedom than before. Feudal lords, weakened by loss, can no longer hold their grip as tightly. Villages rebuild and trade routes reopen slowly. Out of devastation comes unexpected change, an economic and social shift that sets the stage for the Renaissance. The Black Death, though a tragedy of unimaginable scale, becomes a grim catalyst for transformation. Even centuries later, its shadow lingers. Archaeologists uncover plague pits filled with hastily buried victims, their remains carefully arranged, despite the chaos of the time. These discoveries tell of a society overwhelmed, yet still clinging to dignity. In London, excavations reveal layers of history. Beneath the modern city lie the bones of medieval men, women, and children who faced this terror with courage. Their graves are silent testimonies to resilience, a reminder that humanity endures even its darkest hours. As night falls over this memory of the 14th century, imagine the eerie stillness of a plague-stricken town. The streets are empty doors, barred windows shuttered. A single cart creaks through the square, its wheels echoing like drumbeats. Lantern light flickers over the faces of the men, pushing it, their expressions hidden by masks. Inside the cart, pale shapes lie still beneath thin shrouds. The bell of the parish church tolls once, twice, and then all is quiet again. The silence feels alive, pressing against the walls of every home. This was the soundscape of the Black Death silence, broken only by the low murmur of prayer and the rustle of rats in the dark. And yet, even here, life stirs. Somewhere in a cottage, a mother cradles her feverish child, singing softly, refusing to give up. In a monastery cloister, a monk kneels before a wooden crucifix, whispering psalms through cracked lips. In a distant field, a farmer digs a grave for his neighbor, placing a cross of rough-hewn wood above the mound. These small acts of care, repeated across countless villages, are threads of light woven into a tapestry of shadow. They remind us that humanity does not only survive darkness, it carries candles through it. As the years pass, the plague's memory fades, but never disappears. It becomes legend, a grim cautionary tale told in hushed voices. Writers and artists immortalize its horrors, filling manuscripts with skeletal figures and paintings with desolate landscapes. The danse macabre becomes a popular theme, showing kings and peasants alike hand in hand, with death a reflection of the era's stark truth. All are equal in the grave. Churches commission towering altarpieces, not only to honor God, but to seek protection from future outbreaks. The plague reshapes spirituality, deepening faith for some, while sowing doubt in others. The Black Death teaches lessons that will echo through time. Quarantine practices, once a desperate experiment, become a standard tool in combating disease. Port cities like Venice begin to isolate ships for 40 days, giving birth to the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni. These measures save lives and change the course of public health. The devastation forces innovation, prompting cities to rethink sanitation, urban planning, and medicine. The scars left by the plague are physical, emotional, and cultural, yet they also spark progress. As we drift away from these plague-stricken years, the sound of church bells fades into the distance. Fields once overrun with weeds begin to bloom again. Children's laughter returns to streets once haunted by silence. Slowly, life reclaims what death had taken. But the Black Death remains etched in history as one of humanity's darkest chapters, a reminder of both our fragility and our resilience. The memory of mass graves and empty towns lingers like a shadow over Europe, shaping its art, faith, and society for centuries to come. And now, as our journey continues through this grim gallery of medieval afflictions, we leave the great pestilence behind. Ahead lies another mystery, a disease far less understood, but no less terrifying. It swept across England in the reign of Henry VII, striking swiftly and vanishing just as suddenly, leaving scholars baffled even today. They called it the sweating sickness, a plague of heat and dread that killed within hours. The path grows strange now, leading us into an enigma of medieval medicine where answers are scarce and fear is palpable. The plague reshaped the very rhythm of daily life. In cities, the hum of commerce fell silent. Once bustling markets now stood empty, their wooden stalls creaking in the wind. Rats darted freely across abandoned tables where fruit had once been stacked in bright pyramids. Cats prowled thin and wary, their eyes glowing in the dim light of lanterns hung above shuttered doorways. Bakers' ovens went cold, their hearths extinguished because there was no one left to knead dough. Churches, once vibrant centers of worship, became grim sanctuaries where the sick were carried on crude wooden stretchers, their bodies laid in aisles meant for prayer. The sweet scent of incense, once comforting, mingled now with the acrid odor of sickness, and priests sang mass for hundreds at a time. Rural landscapes fared little better. Farmers who once rose with the sun to till their fields now lay feverish in bed, their tools rusting in corners, their livestock wandering untended. Sheep and cattle grazed freely through fallow fields, trampling crops as nature reclaimed the work of human hands. In some regions, orchards grew wild, their branches heavy with fruit no one came to harvest. Bees swarmed around overripe apples, lying in tall grass, and the hum of insects replaced the laughter of children who once played in these meadows. Wolves and foxes crept boldly closer to farmhouses, sensing the absence of humans. The natural world, indifferent and vast, seemed to surge forward in the void left by humanity's retreat. The plague also left deep psychological scars. Some survivors turned inward, retreating into intense piety, believing that only repentance could save them from another wave. They joined processions, barefoot penitents, carrying wooden crosses through deserted streets, chanting prayers, and flagellating themselves until their backs bled. Others, overwhelmed by despair, abandoned faith altogether, convinced that God had turned away from the world. Chroniclers tell of families who barricaded themselves in their homes, sealing windows and doors, leaving messages scrawled in charcoal, begging passers-by not to enter. Inside these shuttered homes, time stretched endlessly, measured only by the tolling of bells and the flicker of candlelight, overdrawn faces. One of the most haunting aspects of the Black Death was the speed with which it could devastate entire households. A child might go to bed with a mild fever and wake with swollen buboes, their cries muffled by exhaustion and fear. Parents watched helplessly as the disease advanced, often claiming them in mere days. The heartbreak of mothers burying children and children burying parents became a grim rhythm of life. Those left behind carried not just physical scars, but deep emotional wounds. Villages that once echoed with music and storytelling around hearthfires grew eerily quiet, their silence a testament to the lives lost. Monasteries became epicenters of both hope and tragedy. Monks cared for the sick with tireless devotion, carrying them into cloisters designed for meditation, but now filled with groans and whispers. They wrote their observations in neat script ink, flowing across parchment, even as their own hands trembled from fever. Many of these manuscripts survive today, their pages marked by careful illustrations of blackened swellings and feverish faces. These drawings are not merely scientific, they are acts of witness capturing the humanity of those who suffered. Some monks wrote prayers in the margins, pleading for God's mercy over the patients they sketched. In these pages, the Middle Ages speak softly across time, showing us that even in chaos, there was tenderness. Cultural memory was forever altered. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a recurring motif in art and literature. Artists depicted skeletons leading kings, queens, and peasants alike in a somber procession, their bony fingers clasping human hands. These murals, painted on church walls and in manuscript borders, reflected a world deeply aware of mortality. Yet, there was also a strange comfort in this imagery. It reminded viewers that death was the great equalizer, sparing none but binding all together. Musicians composed hymns, with haunting melodies, their chants echoing through stone cathedrals that had become both houses of worship and temporary hospitals. Trade routes shifted dramatically. Once busy caravans slowed to a crawl, guarded by heavily armed escorts who feared ambush and contagion alike. Ships sat at anchor, their sails furled, as cities debated whether to allow them into harbor. This led to the creation of early quarantine practices, 40 days of isolation for ships before their crews could disembark. The term quarantine, born in this time of terror, would become a cornerstone of public health for centuries. While medieval medicine had few tools to combat the plague, these early policies demonstrated a growing understanding of disease transmission, even if the science behind it was still centuries away. The plague's aftermath was a strange blend of sorrow and opportunity. With so much farmland abandoned, survivors were able to claim property and negotiate better wages for their labor. Former serfs gained freedoms they could never have imagined before the devastation. Villages reorganized themselves, and merchants rebuilt trade networks with fewer but wealthier clients. This transformation laid the foundation for a social shift that would ripple through Europe for generations, weakening the feudal system and giving rise to a new middle class. Out of death, ironically, came a kind of rebirth, though it was stained by grief. And grief was everywhere. In Florence, Boccaccio would later describe how families abandoned their sick, how corpses piled in the streets, and how love and compassion seemed to vanish under fear's shadow. Yet his words also capture something remarkable. Even amid this terror, acts of humanity persisted. Neighbors risked their lives to comfort the dying. Priests carried the sacraments from house to house, their own health sacrificed to offer comfort. Grave diggers labored until their hands bled, burying strangers with dignity. This duality, fear and compassion, existing side by side, defines the Black Death's legacy as much as the death toll itself. Centuries later, archaeologists unearth plague pits and mass graves, studying the remains with reverence. Careful examination reveals that even in crisis, many bodies were laid with care, arms crossed, or rosaries clutched in skeletal fingers. Some pits contained layers of lime, a sign of attempts to purify the earth and protect the living. The evidence speaks to a society overwhelmed, but still deeply human. These graves are time capsules, silent proof that even in an age of terror, people clung to rituals and dignity. The plague's psychological shadow stretched far beyond its physical devastation. It shaped theology, deepening both faith and doubt. Some people turned to mysticism, joining secretive sects, or traveling from village to village, preaching repentance. Others pursued knowledge with renewed urgency, seeking natural explanations rather than solely divine ones. These twin responses, faith and inquiry, would eventually help Europe transition into a new era of discovery. The Renaissance, often seen as a period of light and learning, was born partly from this crucible of suffering. As centuries pass, the Black Death becomes legend, its reality almost too vast to comprehend. In stories and songs, its horrors are softened but never erased. The figure of the plague doctor with his bird-like mask becomes iconic, a haunting image of fear and resilience. Even today, museums display these masks, and their empty glass eyes seem to stare across time, a chilling reminder of humanity's long battle with disease. Picture now a winter night in plague-stricken London. Snowflakes drift through an empty market square, settling on wooden carts abandoned in haste. The windows of nearby houses glow faintly, though most are shuttered tight. In one home, a mother kneels beside her husband, his breathing shallow, his face pale beneath sweat-soaked linens. She hums softly, rocking slightly, though she knows the fever will claim him before dawn. Across the city, similar scenes unfold in silence, each household a world unto itself united in grief. And yet, within this silence, the human spirit endures. Candles burn late into the night, a defiant light against the darkness. When spring comes, it brings no true relief. The plague does not vanish with the changing seasons, but ebbs and flows like a tide no one can predict. Survivors step cautiously into sunlight, tending gardens overgrown during the months of fear. Children laugh again in streets where carts once carried the dead, their voices carrying on the wind like a promise that life will return. Villages rebuild towns, reopen their markets, and bells that once tolled for funerals now ring for weddings and births. This cycle of devastation and renewal becomes the heartbeat of medieval Europe, a rhythm of loss and resilience. And so we leave behind this shadowed chapter, stepping softly through silent graveyards and ruined streets as though we are travelers passing through a dream. The memory of the Black Death will never truly fade. It lingers in the architecture of cities, rebuilt in the art that reflects mortality, and in the collective memory of humanity itself. But there are more mysteries ahead, more stories whispered by history's long corridors. The path leads now to a different kind of terror, an illness that baffled physicians, struck down the strong in hours, and vanished as suddenly as it came. It was called the sweating sickness, and even today it remains one of medicine's greatest enigmas. A thick mist curls over the River Thames, wrapping the city of London in a pale spectral glow. The year is 1485, and the streets are alive with change. The Wars of the Roses have ended, and Henry Tudor has claimed the throne, ushering in a new dynasty. Merchants bustle in narrow lanes, their carts creaking under barrels of wine and spices, while apprentices shout greetings, and boys chase one another through the fog. But beneath this bustling surface lies unease, an invisible menace slipping quietly into homes, palaces, and taverns. It begins not with sores or coughing, but with a strange, sudden heat. The sweating sickness strikes like a bolt of lightning. A healthy man might rise at dawn, feeling strong and ready for the day, only to collapse by evening, his body drenched in sweat, his breathing ragged. This disease is a predator of the young and strong, claiming its victims in hours. Unlike the Black Death, which painted its horrors on the skin, This fever leaves little mark. It burns through the body like a hidden fire, and then it is gone sometimes, taking its host with it. Chroniclers wrote of men laughing in taverns at midday dead before nightfall, their families bewildered by the speed of their loss. The first wave of this mysterious sickness swept across London in the summer heat, creeping into the city like mist rolling in from the river. Merchants whispered about soldiers returning from battle carrying a strange fever. Rumors spread that it came from foreign lands, from across the Channel, or perhaps from the battlefields where Henry's army fought. People lit candles to saints and sprinkled herbs across thresholds, but the fever ignored charms and prayers alike. Within weeks, panic rippled through the capital. Its symptoms were swift and terrifying. Victims complained, first of chills so severe that teeth chattered uncontrollably, their bodies trembling, as though seized by an invisible hand. Then came the fever rising so quickly it seemed to consume them from within. Sweat poured down their faces, soaking linen shirts and straw mattresses. The air in sick rooms grew heavy with the smell of salt and sickness, the sharp tang of fear clinging to the rafters. Hearts raced pounding painfully in their chests, and breathing grew shallow and desperate. Some suffered crushing chest pain, while others slipped into delirium whispering nonsense, or reciting prayers over and over. Many died before dawn. The sheets beneath them drenched their fuss pale and still. Unlike plague or smallpox, the sweating sickness offered no time for preparation. Families could not summon priests or dig graves in advance. Death came too quickly. Coffins were hastily built, and bodies were buried in rows, sometimes without ceremony. London's churches rang their bells until the ropes frayed their mournful chimes, carrying over the river as barges ferried the dead downstream for burial. The fear was palpable. Neighbors bolted doors and windows, shunning one another, yet the fever slipped through barriers with ease. What baffled physicians most was its selectivity. The disease seemed to favor the strong and young. Infants and the elderly often survived, while men in their prime collapsed in hours. Nobles and commoners alike fell victim, but foreign merchants and travelers often escaped unscathed, leading some to believe that the sickness was uniquely English. Foreign visitors wrote letters home describing an invisible plague that moved like a phantom, striking only those born on English soil. Theories flourished. Some claimed the air itself was cursed. Others believed the Thames carried poison in its waters. Physicians offered little more than guesswork, prescribing purges, bleeding, and herbal concoctions that provided no relief. The city changed overnight. Streets once alive with chatter became quiet. Taverns emptied, theaters closed, and churches filled with mourners rather than worshippers. Candles burned day and night in windows, signaling households in mourning. The smell of smoke and herbs filled the air as families burned juniper, rosemary, and sulfur in a desperate attempt to ward off the sickness. Some people fled London entirely, seeking refuge in the countryside, only to find that the fever followed them. Yet just as mysteriously as it appeared, the sweating sickness would vanish. By autumn, the fever loosened its grip, leaving behind confusion and sorrow. Families mourned their losses and slowly returned to daily life. But whispers of the disease lingered like smoke after a fire. Years passed, and people dared to believe it was gone forever until the next outbreak came. In 1507, it returned with the same swiftness. Then again, in 1517, 1528, and 1551. Each wave was a grim reminder that the sickness could reappear without warning. The outbreak of 1528 was particularly brutal, spreading far beyond England's shores. Ships carried the fever across the Channel to Hamburg, Antwerp, and beyond. In some cities, half the population perished within weeks. Chroniclers wrote of streets littered with bodies, funeral bells tolling ceaselessly, and entire households wiped out overnight. Yet just as before, the fever retreated, as suddenly as it came, leaving behind a trail of questions. No one understood its cause. Was it carried by fleas, like plague? Was it spread through water, through air, or through touch? To this day, its mystery remains unsolved. Imagine a Tudor home during one of these outbreaks. The timbered house leans slightly over the narrow lane, its upper story shadowing the cobblestones below. Inside, the rushes on the floor are fresh-scented, faintly of dried herbs, but the smell of sweat overpowers everything. A man lies on a bed near the fire, his face pale, his body trembling violently. His wife kneels beside him, dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth, whispering prayers between sobs. Their children huddle in a corner, eyes wide with fear. A physician arrives, his robes heavy with the scent of spices meant to purify the air. He examines the man briefly, shaking his head before prescribing a sweat cure. More blankets, more heat, and more herbs. The family obeys, wrapping the man tightly, hoping to sweat out the poison. By dawn, he is gone. His breath stilled his skin cold, despite the fire. The cycle repeated across England. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, all shared the same fate. Letters from courtiers and ambassadors speak of chaos at the royal court, where Henry VIII himself fled from palace to palace, in fear convinced that isolation was the only defense. Servants burned bundles of herbs in every room, and courtiers wore pomanders filled with spices around their necks. Yet even royalty could not escape fear's shadow. In 1528, Anne Boleyn, not yet queen, fled the court during an outbreak while other members of Henry's inner circle succumbed. The sweating sickness left a deep mark on England's collective psyche. Unlike plague, which had been a terror of generations past, this disease was faster, quieter, and stranger. Its unpredictability made it all the more frightening. Families lived with an ever-present dread, knowing that a single evening could change everything. Chroniclers described towns where laughter vanished, replaced by hushed voices and cautious glances. The sound of a neighbor coughing could send an entire household into hiding. Its sudden disappearance in the mid-16th century only deepened its mystery. After the outbreak of 1555, the sweating sickness faded from records, never to return in its terrifying form. Modern scientists have speculated about its cause: hantavirus, relapsing fever, even anthrax. But no theory fully explains its speed, selectivity, and vanishing act. It remains a riddle of history, an echo of fear that lingers in Tudor manuscripts and diaries. In literature and folklore, the disease became almost supernatural. Tales spread of ghosts and spirits sweeping through towns, leaving death in their wake. Some compared the sickness to a curse cast upon England, punishment for war or sin. Others saw it as a test of faith, a reminder of humanity's utter fragility. In paintings, artists captured images of sweating patients, their faces glistening under candlelight, attendants fanning them with feathers as though battling invisible flames. These works carry an intimacy that makes the fear of that time palpable even now. Picture walking through a Tudor street at night during an outbreak. Lanterns flicker in windows, their glow softened against half-timbered facades. The air is thick with the scent of burning herbs, and the usual noise of laughter and music is gone. A priest passes by his black robes, brushing against cobblestones, his lips moving in silent prayer. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls, softly marking another death. A dog barks in the distance, then falls silent. The city feels suspended, holding its breath, waiting for the fever to pass. The sweating sickness was not as widespread as plague or smallpox, yet its impact was profound. It left behind a cultural memory of sudden, inexplicable death, shaping how Tudor society viewed health and mortality. Wealth and power offered no shield, and its unpredictability fostered a deep sense of humility. Even today, its mystery captures the imagination. Historians sift through old letters and parish records, tracing its path through villages and cities, searching for clues. The disease may be gone, but its shadow lingers, a reminder of how fragile life was in an age without medicine or understanding. And so, as the fever's echo fades into history, we step quietly out of these candlelit Tudor homes, their walls steeped in sorrow. Ahead lies another tale, stranger, still a sickness that baffled healers and villagers, alike blamed on witchcraft and curses and treated with rituals as much as remedies. Its name was water elf disease, and though it is lost to time, its story survives in whispers written in ink and prayer. The mystery of the sweating sickness haunted England for nearly a century, weaving itself into the rhythm of life like a dark refrain. Each outbreak left scars not just on families, but on the national psyche. Parish records show entire villages vanishing in a matter of weeks, their names fading from maps. In some towns, churches fell into disrepair because no one remained to ring their bells or tend the gardens. Roads once alive with the rumble of carts and the chatter of merchants became eerily silent, the only movement the wind carrying stray leaves and the distant toll of funeral bells. The disease's strange habits baffled healers. Unlike plague or smallpox, which carried visible warning signs, the sweating sickness left little trace, other than its signature fever and torrents of perspiration. Physicians, still steeped in the humoral theory of medicine, believed the sickness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. They prescribed treatments meant to restore harmony, purges emetics, and ironically, more sweating. Patients were often wrapped in heavy blankets and placed near roaring hearths, their bodies soaked in sweat as their hearts raced. These sweat cures sometimes hastened death, but families clung to them because there was nothing else to try. Others turned to faith. Churches filled with anxious parishioners, clutching candles, their whispered prayers rising like incense toward vaulted ceilings. In rural parishes, priests led processions through fields, sprinkling holy water on crops and homes, asking God to spare their flocks and families. Villagers carved protective symbols into door frames, hung sprigs of lavender or rosemary in windows, and wore small reliquaries around their necks. The fear of unseen forces was deeply rooted. Many believed the sickness was a curse, perhaps cast by witches or brought on by England's sins. Letters from the time capture the strangeness of this disease. A merchant in London wrote to his brother in Calais of the stoutest health fall in the morn, and are buried before the setting of the sun. This sweat is a thing unseen, and none can reckon its cause. Another account tells of a lord who woke healthy, played a game of cards, and then collapsed at dinner, dead before dessert was served. Such stories became common, feeding an atmosphere of paranoia. Even the wealthiest households felt vulnerable, their wealth and status meaningless against an enemy that struck without warning. In palaces, fear was palpable. Henry VIII's court was constantly on the move, the king fleeing from palace to palace in hopes of outrunning the fever. Courtiers followed, carrying chests of clothing, jewels, and medical supplies. Rooms were fumigated with burning herbs, and servants were ordered to scrub floors with vinegar. Visitors were often turned away, and those who gained entry were carefully watched for signs of illness. The court became a place of whispers and glances, where power and politics continued under a shadow of dread. Among common folk, coping with the sickness required quiet resilience. In villages, neighbors banded together to care for the sick, risking their own lives out of loyalty and love. Some families fled to isolated cottages in the countryside, hoping to avoid infection. But many of these remote households became their own prisons, sealed off from the outside world. Supplies dwindled, and fear gnawed at their spirits as days turned into weeks of waiting. The epidemic of 1551 was one of the most devastating. Chroniclers described a country in chaos, with markets empty, churches closed, and entire towns transformed into ghostly landscapes. A physician named John Caius wrote a detailed treatise on the disease, one of the first medical works to focus entirely on a single illness. His descriptions are chilling in their precision: sudden chills, oppressive heat, headache, delirium, and profuse sweating, followed by exhaustion, so intense that many slipped quietly into death. Caius observed that the sickness seemed to favor young men, particularly those who lived active lives, a mystery that remains unsolved today. His work reflects a turning point in medical thought, a shift from purely spiritual explanations toward careful observation and record-keeping. In the Tudor imagination, the sweating sickness became a ghostly presence, a specter that could reappear at any time. Plays and poems of the era reference it obliquely, often as a metaphor for danger or sudden fate. Artists rarely depicted it directly, perhaps because it left so few physical marks, but diaries and letters preserve its terror. A widow in Norfolk wrote of losing her husband and 2 sons in a single night, their bodies buried before dawn, while she was left to care for her remaining children in isolation. These intimate records, penned by trembling hands, reveal the deeply personal toll of a disease that often claimed its victims too quickly for formal mourning. Yet, like all tragedies, the sweating sickness left behind more than sorrow. It changed the way people thought about illness, prompting communities to adopt early forms of quarantine and sanitation. Towns posted guards at gates, restricting movement and monitoring travelers for symptoms. Inns required patrons to show letters of health from their home villages. Ships arriving at ports were sometimes held offshore, their crews examined before being allowed to dock. These measures, crude as they were, planted the seeds for modern public health practices. Imagine walking through a Tudor market square in the weeks after an outbreak. The stalls are sparse, their wooden frames weathered and leaning. The smell of herbs still lingers, remnants of fumigation efforts. A few merchants sell their wares cautiously, their eyes darting toward every passerby. Children peek from behind skirts, wary, but curious, their laughter subdued. Church bells ring softly, not for funerals this time, but for evening prayer. The city feels fragile, as though one gust of wind could topple it back into chaos. Yet life returns. Bakers light their ovens again, apprentices sweep the streets, and taverns open their doors, though music plays quietly. These moments of recovery carry a weight of gratitude, each day of health, of victory. The sweating sickness's sudden disappearance remains one of history's great mysteries. After 1515, it simply stopped appearing in records. Some believe it evolved into a less deadly form. Others think it was an entirely separate illness, perhaps a strain of hantavirus or a form of influenza. Theories abound, but no one knows for certain. Its vanishing act adds to its legend, giving it the air of a phantom, a disease that came swiftly, terrified a nation, and then slipped away, leaving only whispers. Centuries later, historians still puzzle over its legacy. In archives, they pore over letters and parish registers, piecing together its path. Scientists examine deep from Tudor-era graves, searching for microscopic clues. So far, the sweating sickness keeps its secrets. Perhaps this mystery is part of its allure, a reminder that even in an age dominated by technology and science, there are chapters of history we cannot fully rewrite. The disease's legacy is more than medical. It is cultural. It shaped Tudor England's understanding of mortality, humility, and community. In a world where plagues and fevers were constant threats, the sweating sickness stood out for its speed and unpredictability. It humbled kings and terrified commoners, leaving behind a national memory of fragility. Yet it also revealed resilience. Families rebuilt, towns revived, and generations carried its story forward, passing down lessons about vigilance and compassion. Picture the end of an outbreak, the first spring after a harsh winter of fear. Villagers gather in a churchyard, the scent of blossoms mixing with the faint aroma of herbs burned for purification. Candles flicker in open windows, not for mourning now, but to celebrate life. Farmers return to their fields, planting crops in soil that has lain untended for months. Children chase each other through narrow streets, their laughter ringing like bells. These simple scenes are testaments to humanity's strength. Even after fear, life always finds a way to return. The sweating sickness remains an enigma, a ghostly footnote in Tudor history, yet its shadow lingers. It reminds us of an era when death was a constant companion, when faith and folklore intertwined, and when a single fever could rewrite the destiny of a family or a nation. In its absence, England rebuilt itself, but the fear it inspired never truly vanished. It echoes still in the diaries, letters and memories of a people who lived through its terror. As we leave the misty Tudor streets behind lanterns, flickering softly in the night, we follow the path of history toward yet another strange illness. This next tale is older still, whispered in manuscripts that speak of witchcraft and curses, of red spots and watery eyes, of rituals that seem half medicine and half magic. It was called the water elf disease, a sickness that baffled healers and priests alike. Its very name carries a hint of folklore, a reminder that medieval medicine was as much about mystery as science. We step quietly now, deeper into that shadowed world where herbs, prayers, and superstition intertwined in humanity's fight to survive. The road narrows as we move further back in time, past bustling Tudor streets, into a world steeped in myth and mystery. Picture a quiet Anglo-Saxon village at dawn, thatched cottages leaning against the mist, their timber frames darkened by years of smoke from the hearth. The air is sharp with the scent of damp grass and wood smoke curling from open chimneys. Roosters crow lazily, and a few dogs stir among stacks of firewood, but the village is still. Inside one of these cottages, a mother sits beside her child's bed, brushing damp hair from his forehead. His nails are blackened, his eyes watery and red, and angry red spots bloom across his arms. She whispers a prayer as she rubs a salve made from herbs into his skin. To her, this is not merely illness. It is enchantment, a curse whispered by unseen spirits. This was the water elf disease, an affliction whose very name evokes magic. First recorded in Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, it was believed to be the work of malicious water spirits, creatures from rivers and marshes, who cast spells on humans, leaving behind fevers, fatigue, and eyes red and weeping. In an age when sickness and the supernatural were intertwined, this disease embodied the fears of a people living close to nature and deeply connected to its mysteries. Medicine was not separate from magic. Charms and remedies were part of the same ritual, blending prayer with practical care. An ancient manuscript known as Bald's Leech Book offers one of the earliest glimpses into treatment. The instructions read like a spell: gather 13 sacred herbs, chant prayers over them 9 times, then boil them in butter and sheep's fat. The ointment was to be smeared over the eyes, forehead, and limbs of the afflicted. Once finished, the discarded herbs were to be cast into a flowing stream, as if returning the sickness to the water spirits themselves. Another version prescribed drinking an ale infused with herbs, while a healer recited charms invoking protection against unseen forces. In these rituals, medicine and folklore became one, a reflection of a world where illness felt alive, almost sentient. Picture a healer at work in a dimly lit hut. Bundles of dried herbs hang from rafters, their earthy fragrance mingling with the smoke from a peat fire. A carved wooden cross leans against a windowsill, and beside it, a clay bowl of water shimmers in the flickering firelight. The healer, an elderly woman with weathered hands, murmurs incantations while grinding roots with a stone pestle. Children peer curiously through the doorway, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. In this time, healers were both revered and distrusted, their craft straddling the line between faith and sorcery. A single whispered blessing might heal or curse a life. The water elf disease, though mysterious, may have been a real infection, perhaps measles, chickenpox, or even endocarditis. But to those who lived through it, science was far away. Illness was a battle between the spiritual and the physical. Families kept charms under pillows, tied amulets around children's necks, and sought blessings from priests alongside herbal remedies. The church encouraged these rituals, often weaving Christian prayers into ancient pagan practices. Priest might bless a salve, while a healer recited psalms over it, blending old and new traditions in a desperate bid to save lives. The image of medieval medicine in this period is almost dreamlike. Monks illuminated manuscripts with intricate designs, their margins filled with curling vines and beasts, while within the text were practical remedies: how to treat fevers with honey and vinegar, how to heal wounds with salves of garlic and onion. Yet even these instructions often included charms. Sing this prayer 3 times over the ointment before applying. The boundary between medicine and magic was porous. When a child's fever broke, villagers believed it was because both God and the healer's charms had intervened. In some cases, however, illness carried prestige rather than fear. Enter scrofula, or the king's evil, a disease that turned swollen lymph nodes into a mark of destiny. Unlike the eerie water elf disease, scrofula was tied to royal power. It was a form of tuberculosis that caused painful swellings in the neck, sometimes breaking open into sores. Yet rather than ostracizing its victims, medieval society treated them as candidates for divine healing. Kings were believed to possess the sacred gift of curing the disease with their touch. Picture a grand medieval cathedral on a feast day. Sunlight filters through stained glass windows, casting jewel-colored patterns across a gathering of the sick. Pilgrims from across this realm wait patiently, some on crutches, others with swollen necks, carefully wrapped in linen. The air hums with expectation. At the far end of the nave, the king himself approaches, clad in robes embroidered with gold thread, his crown glinting in the colored light. Courtiers and clergy walk solemnly at his side, carrying relics and censers that fill the cathedral with sweet-smelling smoke. As the king kneels before the altar, the crowd murmurs prayers. Then, one by one, the afflicted are led forward. The king reaches out, placing his wand gently on each swollen neck, blessing the sufferer with the sign of the cross. This ritual, known as the royal touch, was deeply symbolic. Kings and queens claimed their authority came from God. Healing the sick demonstrated that divine favor flowed through their bloodline. Those touched by the monarch often received a small gold coin or medallion, a token known as an angel, to wear as protection. For many, this was more than a blessing. It was a cure. Reports spread of miraculous recoveries, though whether these were genuine remissions or simply hopeful exaggerations is impossible to know. What mattered most was belief, and belief was powerful medicine. For those who could not reach the king, healers offered alternative treatments. Mercury ointments were common, their metallic tang filling small huts where patients sat stoically as salves were applied to their sores. Mercury was thought to draw out evil humors, and though we now know it was toxic, its side effects were often mistaken for signs that the treatment was working. A patient who vomited or sweated profusely after application was considered to be expelling poison. In this way, suffering itself became a form of hope. The king's evil also reinforced the sacred image of monarchy. Kings like Edward the Confessor and later French rulers used the healing ritual as a political tool, reinforcing their divine right. Crowds gathered not only for healing, but to witness the king's holiness firsthand. Chroniclers describe the ceremony in reverent detail: the hush of the cathedral, the glint of candlelight on the king's robes, and the tears of gratitude from those who felt cured. These moments turned rulers into living saints in the eyes of their subjects. But not all stories were so grand. In small villages, far from royal courts, scrofula patients often lived in pain and isolation. The swellings on their necks could become grotesque oozing sores that made eating and speaking difficult. Families tended to them, tenderly washing wounds with herbal infusions of thyme, sage, and vinegar. Priests visited with prayers and blessings, while neighbors offered gifts of bread or firewood. Illness in these close-knit communities was a shared burden, and compassion softened the sharp edges of fear. Imagine a cottage at dusk, smoke curling from its chimney as a healer mixes a salve in a wooden bowl. A young girl sits by the fire, her neck wrapped in linen, her face pale but calm. Her mother hums softly, weaving a charm into her lullaby, while the healer murmurs a psalm. The flickering light casts dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, the line between ritual and medicine disappears. It is simply care-love expressed through herbs, prayer, and touch. The combination of water elf disease and scrofula tells us much about the medieval worldview. Illness was not just a physical event, it was deeply spiritual. Disease could be a curse or a sign of favor, a punishment or a test. Healing was as much about belief as about herbs and ointments. This mindset shaped medicine for centuries, blending folklore, religion, and observation into a single tapestry. Even today, reading these manuscripts feels like stepping into a dream. Recipes for salves are written alongside charms. Prayers are intertwined with instructions on gathering roots at dawn or boiling herbs beneath an altar. Over time, as science advanced, these diseases began to lose their mystical aura. By the 17th century, the belief in the royal touch waned, replaced by skepticism and scientific inquiry. Yet even as medicine became more clinical, these stories endured. They remind us of a time when illness was personal, when healing involved community ritual and reverence. Archaeologists uncover traces of these lives, small gold angel coins, buried with patience, suggesting they died, believing in their cure. Wooden bowl stained with herbal mixtures, manuscripts with smudges, where healers' fingers rested as they read aloud. Each artifact whispers of hope and care, of humanity's endless quest to ease suffering. Picture walking through a medieval village at twilight, lanterns glowing softly in cottage windows. Somewhere, a healer tends to a patient, chanting prayers over a bowl of steaming herbs. In the distance, church bells ring, the hour their sound mingling with the chirping of crickets. Life is simple, fragile, and deeply intertwined with faith. These quiet scenes of care, repeated over generations, are the heartbeat of medieval history. Gentle reminders that even in fear and pain, people found ways to love and protect one another. As we leave behind these stories of curses, charms, and the healing touch of kings, the world of medieval medicine feels like a tapestry woven from equal parts wonder and fear. We have journeyed through plagues and fevers, through nights lit by candles over the sickbed, through whispers of spirits in streams and blessings from monarchs. Ahead lies a soft landing, the closing of this chapter of history, a gentle reminder of how far we have come and how much of that ancient tenderness we carry still. The connection between sickness and the supernatural ran deep in the medieval mind, and nowhere was this clearer than in the way diseases like water elf illness were perceived. Streams, rivers, and wells held both life and danger. They were sacred places, blessed by saints, yet whispered to be haunted by spirits. Villagers believed that lingering too long by water on moonlit nights could invite a curse, and the water elf disease was thought to be the mark of such encounters. Mothers warned their children not to play near streams alone, not out of fear of drowning, but of being touched by a spirit's hand. Folk remedies reflected these fears. Healers collected herbs only at dawn, when dew clung to their leaves and birdsong filled the air. They spoke words of protection over every plant they plucked, believing its healing power could only be unlocked through reverence. Garlic, yarrow, mugwort, and feverfew were common ingredients, often ground with butter and animal fat into thick ointments. Some healers performed rituals in complete silence, while others chanted psalms as they worked. When a child's fever broke after such care, it felt like a victory over unseen forces. There are accounts of elaborate ceremonies performed to cure this mysterious sickness. One manuscript describes a healer placing a bowl of water beneath an altar during Mass, allowing it to absorb the prayers said above. After 9 Masses were sung, the water was mixed with herbs and salt, boiled until it filled the hut with a pungent aroma. The mixture was strained carefully, the herbs discarded into a flowing river, symbolically returning the illness to the spirits. The salve created from this process was then applied to the patient's eyes and limbs, sealing the ritual. To us, this may sound like superstition, but for those living centuries ago, it was a powerful act of love and faith, one that offered hope in a world where death often felt closer than life. Beyond folklore, diseases like scrofula carried political weight. Kings and queens used their alleged healing powers to reinforce their legitimacy. The royal touch ceremonies were public displays of divine favor. In France, monarchs traced this tradition back to Clovis, claiming a direct line of blessing from God. In England, Edward the Confessor was remembered as a saintly king, whose touch cured hundreds, and later rulers maintained this legacy. These ceremonies were grand events. Pilgrims traveled miles to kneel before the king, their necks wrapped in linen eyes, shining with anticipation. Chroniclers describe these ceremonies vividly. Sunlight streaming through cathedral windows, incense thick in the air, and the murmured prayers of hundreds of worshippers. The king would approach each patient, touch their swollen neck gently, and bless them with holy words. Courtiers carried trays of golden touch pieces, medallions stamped with angels or crosses, which were given to the sick as talismans. For those who believed, these moments were transformative. Even if their bodies remained unhealed, they left with their spirits lifted, convinced they had been chosen to receive the king's blessing. This intertwining of politics, faith, and healing shows us how disease shaped society at every level. Monarchs used their supposed gifts to unify kingdoms. Healers became pillars of their communities, and priests blended scripture with ancient herbal lore. Medicine in this age was not clinical. It was deeply human. A patient was not just a body in need of treatment, but a soul in need of comfort. Every salve, every prayer, every ritual carried emotional weight. For families, caring for the sick was a communal act. In villages, neighbors often assisted one another, gathering firewood, bringing bread and broth, and helping to wash and dress wounds. Illness was not hidden away. It was part of the rhythm of life. Children grew up watching parents and grandparents tend to the sick, learning the importance of compassion early. Even in the face of terrifying diseases, there was a sense of unity, of shared humanity. The line between healer and patient blurred. Almost everyone became a caretaker at some point in their lives. Imagine the quiet intimacy of these moments. A grandmother sits at a bedside, gently stroking her grandson's hair as he sleeps fitfully, a damp cloth cooling his forehead. A father grinds herbs with a mortar and pestle his rough hands steady as he prepares medicine. The soft crackle of the fire fills the silence, and the only other sound is the whisper of a prayer. These scenes, repeated countless times across centuries, are small yet profound testaments to resilience. Even scrofula, with its grotesque sores and swollen glands, could not rob people of dignity. Portraits from the era show patients proudly wearing their gold, angel coins, tokens of the king's blessing. Pilgrims carried these medallions home, telling stories of their journey, their encounter with royalty, and their hope for healing. These tales strengthened the mystique of monarchy, creating a bond between ruler and subject that transcended politics. But there was also skepticism. As the Renaissance dawned, scholars began questioning long-held beliefs, including the royal touch. Physicians trained in universities studied anatomy, wrote treatises, and debated whether the king's gift was spiritual or merely symbolic. This tension between tradition and science marked a turning point. The medieval world's enchantment with illness slowly gave way to a new understanding, yet the stories of miraculous cures never truly disappeared. Archaeology provides a window into these lives. Excavations of medieval burial sites reveal bones with signs of scrofula, swollen vertebrae, fused joints, and telltale lesions. Yet alongside these remains, archaeologists often find evidence of care, carefully arranged graves, rosaries clutched in skeletal hands, and medallions placed on chests. These discoveries confirm what chronicles suggest. Even when cures failed, families treated their loved ones with tenderness and reverence. The dead were laid to rest with dignity, and faith surrounded them in their final moments. In monasteries, the role of healing was central. Monks cultivated medicinal gardens, filling their cloisters with lavender, sage, rosemary, and rue. They created ointments and tinctures based on recipes recorded in illuminated manuscripts, their pages glowing with vibrant illustrations. These books were more than medical guides. They were works of devotion, each page a labor of love. Monks copied texts from ancient Greece and Rome, blending classical wisdom with Christian belief. In these gardens and scriptoria, medicine evolved slowly, nurtured by a combination of tradition and faith. Walk through a reconstructed medieval monastery, and you can almost smell the mingling scents of herbs drying in the sun. Stone corridors echo softly beneath your footsteps, and in the infirmary, simple wooden beds line the walls covered with woolen blankets. Light filters through narrow windows, casting golden beams on tables cluttered with jars, bowls, and manuscripts. Here, healers worked tirelessly, tending not only to monks, but to villagers who came seeking aid. The monastery was a sanctuary of knowledge, one of the few places where medicine and faith coexisted in harmony. Water elf disease, with its folkloric name, reminds us how close medieval people felt to the natural world. Streams, forests, and hills were alive with meaning. Illness was not just a random misfortune, but often seen as a message or warning from the divine or from nature itself. This worldview, though superstitious by modern standards, gave life depth and interconnectedness. Healing was a dialogue between humanity and the unseen forces shaping their lives. Scrofula, in contrast, tied sickness to power. The belief in the king's touch symbolized more than health. It represented order, divine favor, and unity. In a fragmented world where war and plague often tore communities apart, the ritual of healing by royal hands became a beacon of hope. For some, even standing in the king's presence was enough to restore courage, if not health. Both of these diseases, though very different in perception, show us how medieval society navigated fear with creativity, ritual, and faith. They remind us that medicine has always been more than science. It is deeply human. Behind every treatment, no matter how strange it may seem to us now, was a story of love and hope. As we imagine this era, let's pause to picture one last scene, a medieval healing ceremony in full. Pilgrims from across the countryside gather outside a cathedral at dawn, their cloaks dusted with frost, their breath curling in the cold air. Bells toll softly, calling them inside. Sunlight spills through stained glass, painting the nave in blues and reds. The king appears robes, sweeping the stone floor, a crown gleaming in the light. The sick kneel as he moves among them, his hand resting briefly on each bowed head. Priests murmur prayers, incense drifts upward, and the entire scene feels suspended between heaven and earth. Whether or not anyone is truly cured, hope fills the cathedral like music. We leave this chapter of medieval medicine with the echo of that hope still in our ears. These stories are not just tales of disease, but of resilience, how people clung to ritual, faith, and community to survive an unpredictable world. As we step forward from this candlelit era into the light of modern medicine, we carry with us their lessons that healing is not only about science, but about love, courage, and connection. The flicker of our lantern softens as we step back from these shadowed corridors of the Middle Ages, where every illness carried a story, every remedy a prayer, and every life was a fragile flame. We've wandered through streets where plague carts rattled over cobblestones, through smoky cottages filled with whispers of fear and hope, and through cathedrals where kings laid their hands on the sick, offering blessings that felt like miracles. In this world, sickness was not a distant concept, but a constant companion, woven into daily life, like the tolling of church bells or the scent of wood smoke clinging to cloaks. Yet amid the terror, there was always tenderness. Mothers sat up through the night beside feverish children. Monks illuminated manuscripts with golden ink, while caring for strangers and neighbors, carried water bread and firewood to those too weak to leave their beds. Even in centuries defined by fear, the human heart shone stubbornly, refusing to let darkness claim it entirely. Today, we look back with wonder. Science has replaced superstition. Antibiotics have banished so many of these nightmares, and yet these stories remain a reminder of where we come from. They tell us that healing has always been more than medicine. It is an act of love, courage, and connection. So, as you drift toward sleep tonight, imagine those distant streets now quiet, the candlelight fading in ancient halls, the soft chant of monks echoing like a lullaby through time. History carries its weight gently, like a warm blanket over weary shoulders, and you are safe here, carried by the echoes of all who came before. Rest now, traveler, and let the centuries settle around you like mist, soft and still.